Joining me right now, Erica DiAngelo, a business attorney with Angelo Law. Thank you for stopping by again.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's take this quiz, folks. Here's the quiz. What does GDPR stand for? I'll let you think about it. Let me put it this way. If you've got a business and you do any kind of business overseas, on the internet, you better know what this is and you better be compliant. All right, tell me what it is. What is GDPR?
GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. It is in effect as of May 25th, and it's a European Union regulation that dictates how data must be stored for businesses.
So this has been around for 2 years, so this was actually, they were building it in place while we were having our Facebook fits and all these other kind of things of our information and data being released. So let's start at the beginning. What are their protections? Well, how are they different than what we are required to protect?
So up until the 25th, we were not required to take very precautious measures with data. So the European Union considers things as simple as your name and email address to be data that must be protected.
Okay.
Whereas over here, we think of data that needs to be protected more like name, social security number, credit card information, things along those lines. So this protection applies to all types of data, and it applies to how you can gain that data and what effect you can have when you collect that data.
I'm really curious if culturally there's anything why they were so much more protective of data than we are, because we tend to think of ourselves as being a democracy and a republic, but we tend to protect things, but their rules are so much more stringent.
Well, they view it more as they're the owners of the data. So when you voluntarily hand over information to somebody else, it doesn't make them the owner of the data. You remain the owner. So that's why you get to dictate how they can handle your data.
Which has been different, if you know, with Facebook and some of these others where there was some of that data was being sold. So I'm going to walk you through some of these questions. So we already know that it's in effect as May 25th. Did all businesses that you know comply with it, or did they kind of lollygag around for 2 years?
I think many of the big businesses are now compliant, but there's already a lawsuit filed against Facebook and a couple other big companies.
Already?
Already, just minutes after midnight.
Okay, so technically, who does that affect? Who does the GDPR affect?
The GDPR affects anybody, obviously in the EU, but small businesses who are based in the United States who have a global presence, because a European Union citizen could get on your website, type in their data, their name, their email addresses, etc.
So we're talking about eBay, Amazon. I mean, we could go on and on and on. That's a whole list. So what are the penalties if you don't comply? And having said that, how do they know that you do or don't comply? Is it word of honor, or is there a test that they take, or do they send somebody to make sure their data is compliant? What?
There is a voluntary process where you can say, look, I'm compliant, but really what happens is if there's a data breach and they find out that you didn't comply with all the regulations, and at that point the people's information could be unsecure or something along those lines. That's when it's really a problem.
Do we assume, and I'm being broad here, do we assume that if our data had been protected the way the European Union wants their data to be protected, that maybe some of the breaches that we've seen right now would not have happened maybe?
Exactly. So the Cambridge Analytica thing that happened with Facebook, that wouldn't have happened because they got consent from the users, but then took the data and used it ways that they didn't have consent to use. And that's exactly one of the things that the GDPR requires. You have to get consent to use it for each way that you're planning on using that information.
And that says, what are the penalties for non-compliance? Boy, this is 4% of annual global turnover?
Yes, 4% of your revenue.
Up to $20 million.
20 million euros, yes. So. Right, so whichever is greater is actually the limit.
And who was the one levying the fine? The European Union?
That's right. Well, and since we're in the United States, it actually raises some questions of international law. Typically, the United States has always worked alongside with the EU and backed each other, but one of the regulations that's previously allowed that has not been technically amended yet, so we will see.
Technically amended, what does that mean? That sounds lawyer terms, right?
There isn't an amendment, but that doesn't mean that the United States can't cooperate and enforce the GDPR.
What are the odds that now our big companies will not only become GDPR compliant, but they might decide, hey, maybe this is a standard that we in the United States ought to create for ourselves?
Well, I think that they're all trying to get GDPR compliant, the big companies at least. I think a lot of the small companies aren't even aware that they need to be compliant, and I think that there's a lack of staff knowledge about the GDPR. But I do think that the larger companies have already spent billions of dollars to trying to get compliant.
To make sure, right.
And so they'll certainly lead the way for how data should be protected. But there's so many unknowns at this point now that it's actually taken effect.
Yeah.
You know, the cases that have been filed, how are the judges going to rule, what's going to come out, and so I think there's just a lot of unknowns at this point.
So when you talk about personal data, what constitutes personal data?
In the context of GDPR, personal data is your name and your email address.
Name,
anything.
email address, right. Anything. Oh, anything. Wow.
Virtually, yes.
Wow. So they couldn't even use you to figure out what age people are buying certain products or anything like that because it's all protected. Now, do they have the same kind of things where you opt in and opt out, where this gets really confusing, where you know, if you agree to this, that means your material is going to be used, rather than saying we need your permission to use your data?
Yeah, they have opt-in, opt-out, but it's more in-depth than that. So you can also request, under certain circumstances, a complete erasure of all information that they have on your behalf. You can request disclosure of exactly how they're using your information, and whether or not your information is being encrypted, or some sort of methodology where if there was a data breach, that the theft, basically, the thief would not be able to understand what that data means.
And do they treat minors any different than adults?
So the GDPR allows different countries to use different ages for what's considered an adult, but yes, an adult would be considered 16 or older for the vast majority. Now,
this is kind of a technical matter. So each company needs to have something called a data protection officer. In other words, somebody that's probably on a piece of paper. Who is your data protection officer as you're complying with this GDPR? So is that the way that works, probably?
It's not every single company that needs a data protection officer, but companies that are doing high volume processing with your information and that meet certain criteria will have to designate a data protection officer, and this person will work with the IT side, with the legal side, and then make sure that your data is regulated. And this person will actually have to be designated where somebody who has a question about their data and how it's being used can reach out and contact this person.
Can you imagine the paperwork would be required if every person in America said, I want to know exactly how all of my data has been used and where you used it and when you used it?
That's why there's a lot of unknowns. Some of it just doesn't seem practical.
Wow. Well, Erica, thank you for bringing this to our attention, and get back to us, because I know we've been getting a lot of phone calls here, and hopefully we're able to straighten out that little bit. It's called You Better Comply or Else, right?
That's right.
All right, Erica, thank you.
If you have any questions, there's also a hotline that you can call.
Oh, really? What's it called?
It's just a GDPR hotline.
Okay. GDPR hotline. Well, we'll put it on our website if you need it, though. But General Data Protection Regulations in effect right now, thanks to the European Union. Thank you, Erica. Good talking to you.